Hey, so this is going to be a follow-up video to the first video I did on PaxTube called Why PaxTube is a Religious Pseudo-Intellectual. The reason I'm doing this video is because that video honestly got far more views than I was expecting it to. I did not put, admittedly, as much time and energy as I put into some of my other top viewed videos like Why Japan is Becoming a Nation of Incels. It was admittedly not even at a great time in life, and I was really tired and bedraggled when I made that video. And now, much to my surprise, it's become my third most viewed video and might soon even become even higher. So I want to just address some things in that video that I maybe did not entirely address fully in the first one. Of course, for those of you who didn't watch the video, mostly on that one, I focus on PaxTube's video he made on the sexual revolution. Not some of his other videos that are more historical-based videos like the French Revolution, etc., etc. This video is just going to be kind of going into and expanding on some of the things I mentioned in that one, as well as kind of just emphasizing what my main point and my main areas of disagreement were, as well as bringing up a few extra things. I watched PaxTube's video again and made some new notes on it today, and it kind of remained. I had been wondering, it had been 6 months since I made the original, and I'd been kind of wondering why was it again I chose to do this one on the sexual revolution, since I'm not really the most knowledgeable. Well, I don't know if knowledgeable is the word I use, but I don't know if I'm the best in the world at addressing matters that have to do with those kind of things, because I'm a little bit of an awkward, nerdy guy, and sometimes it just comes off as weird when I talk about those kind of things. But then I watched the video and I remembered again, it's because the video it reminded me of a lot of the worst elements of what I was brought up with and what I still occasionally have to deal with from the very, very religious conservative background that I came from. And in fact, it's even worse, that's pretty rare that I run across people that are almost even worse in terms of their views than the religious people that I grew up with were. I mean, because a lot of stuff that PaxTube mentions in his videos just are flat out factually incorrect, and just his bias being thrown in there as a fact, as well as major historical misrepresentations mixed in with some facts, and he's counting on the fact that his audience is too poorly informed to catch on to any of this, which, judging by the comments section that I looked at after I read his video, I think that's probably a good judgment on his part, because most of the people on there were just glowing praise for his video. But anyways, now I'm going to get into kind of what my main point here is of where I'm disagreeing with PaxTube's video. Essentially, the number one point that PaxTube makes in his video is that prior to the sexual revolution in the United States, we had good Christian morality that gave us objective morality and kept everything in order and essentially kept America as a healthy nation. That's an oversimplification, but that's the bottom line. And then after the sexual revolution, we now live in an age of nihilism in which everything is tolerated and everything has gone to pot. Well, the main point I'm going to be making about this is that no, not everything is tolerated in the modern world. And I think that's a pretty obvious point to anyone who thinks about it for more than about 10 to 20 seconds with a non-biased viewpoint. But I'm going to try to go into it in a little more detail here for those people that need this to be explained to them. Okay, and the first thing I'm going to do is compare three behaviors that he listed that were not tolerated back in the 1800s that are tolerated today, and compare them with three behaviors that are not tolerated today that were tolerated back then. Okay, and the three behaviors I've chosen from his video were divorce, homosexuality, and porn, pornography. Those are three things that are not tolerated, or that are tolerated today. And three things that are not tolerated today that he does not mention in this video: child marriage, age of consent, and polygamy. And starting with the last one, polygamy, it's kind of the one I have the least points to make about it because, I mean, to be honest, it's kind of obvious in many ways. But for those of you that don't know, polygamy used to be much more common in the US, and it still is practiced here and there by some Mormon cults. They always encounter some random group somewhere off in the middle of nowhere where a bunch of 12-year-old girls are married off to some 60-year-old guy. And it's disgusting, but it still happens. But it wasn't until 1882 and the Edmunds Anti-Polygamy Act of 1882 that we saw polygamy completely banned within the United States. And polygamy has been a common thing throughout a lot of human history as well. But it's part of one thing that is not tolerated today that used to be tolerated. And if you agree with it, well, in terms of if you think polygamy should be legal, there's not much I can say. That's just a difference in value judgment. But as for why I disagree with polygamy, I think it greatly favors certain older men over both other men as well as women, of course. Women who are forced to usually marry much older men in large numbers and are then heavily exploited and under the control of those men. And it just generally is meant to favor older, more powerful, and wealthy men at the expense of other men as well as women. And that's why I personally disagree with it. I believe it's ripe for abuse and exploitation. And again, I'm not dressing this up as an objective fact because, as I've said many times, a lot of things I believe are subjective. You can get some statistics and to verify why you think it's good or bad, or you can get some statistics as to why you think it's, or I could trot out statistics for you here. But at the end of the day, most things are subjective, including a lot of statistics and how those are brought out. As someone who is a finance and accounting major, while that's not the same as a statistics and data major, one thing I have learned about data and statistics is you have to take all of them with a grain of salt. Not that they're invalid or that you shouldn't use them, but ultimately, a lot of things in life are heavily subjective, one way or the other, no matter how you look at it. And then going into comparing that with one behavior that he talks about that is now permissible, that used to not be permissible, divorce. I addressed this in my last video. Divorce is, of course, much more common now than it used to be, and divorces are very common. I believe the statistic used to be a long time ago, 1 out of every 2 marriages end in divorce. That was a long time ago, though, and I don't know if it's higher or lower now. But it's still, I have never heard, the last time I heard someone said it was roughly around that range. It's a little over 1 out of every 2 marriages. And some people believe that to be a terrible thing. I guess it just depends how you view it. I guess the negatives of divorce is that it can lead to single-parent households that don't want to be single-parent households, and maybe some would say having 2-parent households is better for raising kids. On the other hand, there's a very good case to make that having people that are in a marriage that they don't want to be in, that's a 2-parent household, may not be the most conducive environment for raising a kid in. And many cases in which those divorces are initiated are also beneficial for the kid because sometimes one of the spouses could be abusive to the child, both physically and or sexually. There's multiple reasons why it's not necessarily clear-cut a better thing for a child to have necessarily a 2-parent household. But also, the number one reason why I support keeping divorce legal is, as I mentioned in my previous video, and once again, this is just a value judgment, is that I don't believe divorce is the problem. Bad relationships are the problem, okay? And divorce is simply the solution used to the problem, okay? If you believe that bad relationships should be forced forever on people, well, I don't know what I can really say to you other than I disagree. But no, I very much know many people that if they were still married to the people they had gotten, and even this is including conservative Christians, such as one of my cousins who's an ultra-conservative Christian, but her first marriage was an absolute catastrophe. And of course she got divorced and remarried then to another guy who had ironically himself also been divorced once. She condemns all the same things that PaxTube does, being a religious conservative, but I doubt she would want to still be married to her first husband, And I generally find this amongst a lot of religious people. They have plenty of exceptions in place for things that are beneficial to them in their own lives. But yeah, I mean, again, if you disagree, I don't know. Again, I can't really say much about it other than it's just my own value judgment. But moving on, now going on to the age of consent. This one is a bit of a tricky topic because there has always been, at least to some extent, some different things on age of consent and some different practices. The age of consent laws in 1880 in the United States, if I can roll it up 1 second. Sorry, okay. It varies, of course, by state, just like it does now. But one thing you're going to find is age of consent used to be much lower, and tolerance for both sexual intercourse with underage people as well as child marriages, which we'll get into that in a second, used to be much more permissible in the 1800s and especially before then, back in the Middle Ages, than they are in the modern world. For instance, in the current state which I reside, Arizona, in 1884, The age of consent was 12. And currently, or at least in 2007, it's 18, which it's still 18 here in 2024. And again, this is from gmu.edu, which is a university's website. And again, take everything with a grain of salt that I take. Like I said, any statistics brought in here as a grain of salt. That's the reason I don't go to great troubles to try to quote some of my statistics other than just telling you what my reference is. Because at the end of the day, if you want, actual hard data on this, I suggest you go to more than a YouTube video. I suggest, at the very least, documentaries or going to some, websites and comparing different ones, because there can be a lot of different ways data can be represented. But this is honestly a thing that's, anybody who knows anything about the age of consent can confirm that to you. For instance, just taking another country into account, Japan. Japan has for a long time had an incredibly low age of consent. It was just recently in, I believe, 2021, though I might be wrong on the year of that. If I am wrong, I apologize. It was brought up to 16 from 13 in Japan. And for a very long time, both child porn and the age of, child porn was tolerated in Japan, and the age of consent was 13 or lower. Age of consent laws in general have been going up in most places, and like most people, I do support that in general. I think that as long as it's, the only exception I would make on that is I think that they should not include that when when the acts are between people that are both underage people. I think it should only be focusing mostly on adults who are well over the age of 18 and people who are under the age of 18. But just to pull a few other states out of my hat for you here, just while we're already on this data page about age of consent, looking throughout most of the U.S. states and their age of consent back in 1884. Most of them here, like Michigan, Minnesota, Mississippi, all about 10 years old. New York, one of the biggest states in the U.S., 10 years old. California, 10 years old. And of course, most of these states now are much different. California is now 18. Michigan, 16. Minnesota, 18. Mississippi, 16, 17. Or 17, Missouri. New York, 17. So again, here's a thing that's changed a lot. Oh, and by the way, the year for all of these new age of consents are 2007. Now, they could be updated now being 2024, and probably a few of them are, but that's when this data is from. So anyways, again, there is one thing, again, that answers his argument of what is and is not permissible as opposed to back then. This has changed enormously, how we view age of consent. And one example, while this is obviously a fictional example that I wanted to bring up, was I just about a couple of months or so ago watched the movie Pretty Baby. And for those of you that haven't seen it, it's a 1978 movie starring Brooke Shields back when she was 11. And she plays the daughter of a prostitute who works in a New Orleans brothel back when New Orleans had a red light district. And her obviously growing up in a brothel, she becomes sexually exploited herself by the lady who runs the brothel. And one scene in it that's pretty disturbing is where her virginity is being auctioned off to a bunch of adult men. And, at the time, of course, the movie, she's supposed to be about 12 years old. And Brooke Shields, they actually did have her being 12 years old. Or 11 or 12, I forget how old Brooke was when she was in it. And that is something, by the way, that's criticized in the movie, and I criticize as well, that they should have used an adult actress, not an actual 12-year-old, for a sexualized role. Again, I agree that that's a different topic, but I'm just mentioning that, by the way. But anyways, the movie was not meant to, and some people watch the movie and you read the comments on some of the, because I watched some of the YouTube clips of it before I watched the movie, and it's amazing how many idiots in the comments section were all like, this is such a disgusting movie, everyone who made it should be locked up. Well, in case you didn't know, geniuses, this is something that actually did occur in real life, not just in a Hollywood movie, but this has occurred for a long time in human history. And this movie is meant to call attention to it and to remind us. And here's a disturbing thing as well, because, okay, I'm actually merging the child marriage one now with the age of consent one, because I guess you can see why they kind of merge. So I'm combining these 2 points. But child marriages still exist in the United States today, okay? In the year 2018, this current year is 2024, but it wasn't until 2018 that we began to see a nationwide effort to ban all child marriages and have them legally banned. Now, of course, they're not common practice. They're socially extremely ostracized. I've never known anyone married to an adult under the age of 18 myself personally. But they do occur, unfortunately. Um, and still, it's only a small minority of states that have actually taken the necessary actions to make them illegal. And according to the chart that I'm looking at, and this is just from a website called 19thenews.org. I do not know how reliable it is, but I've heard this from many other sources as well, such as an atheist republic that does initiatives to try to ban child marriages. And by the way, not going outside of the US, there are countries where it's explicitly done, and child marriages aren't even combated in some African countries. But going back to the United States, Minnesota, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and I think Delaware are the ones listed as having taken action to ban child marriages. And most others, there are still very, very few laws or none in place to ban it in the year 2024. And these are in states where there are age of consent laws banning sexual intercourse between minors and adults. Okay, now do you realize how messed up this is? This means that, we don't want some we don't want some 60-year-old man having sex with an underage girl or a 60-year-old woman with an underage boy. That's horrible and perverted. But as long as they get married, that's all okay, Then it's a good, wonderful Christian marriage. This is why, and of course that's what, going back to the movie Pretty Baby, that's what kind of goes on in the movie and what the movie is trying to call attention to. Because it almost comes off like a romance movie because one, she's in the brothel, a guy who works as like a camera photographer there, in the brothel, she falls in love with him and vice versa. And of course, he's like in his 30s or whatever, and she's 12. And they do get married in the movie. And the weird thing is that's actually supposed to be kind of an upgrade from where she was at the brothel, though, because, she was being horribly abused at the brothel. And the movie even, you could say it's kind of hard to understand that watching it, but you can kind of tell they're trying to show that it's still an upgrade from where she was. But the point, all the idiots I remember who were reading the comment section were like, this is sickening, this guy is a monster. It's like, but you don't realize this is the way things used to be. Back in your wonderful, perfect world that you think used to exist, it was anything but. This kind of thing was actually far more common practice back then. And it still occurs, okay? This is where I really begin to get very impatient with people who romanticize and fetishize how perfect they think the past used to be. Not everything is perfect with the modern world, and not everything was evil about the past. But there was a lot of practices that you would not believe that used to occur that don't occur in the modern world, or at least are very rare in the modern world. And going back to the movie Pretty Baby, it does have a happy ending. Like her mother, who used to be a brothel worker, comes back and, well, it's kind of a little bit of a bittersweet ending. Like she'd been in a relatively happy marriage with the guy who took her out of the brothel, but Brooke Shields' character, that is. And then she goes to have kind of a normal childhood with her mom and her mom's new husband. So it does have a bit of a happy ending that doesn't result with her being married to an older guy. But the point of the whole movie was to call attention to the fact that these practices occurred and that they still occur. And this movie was made back in 1978, so it's pretty old now. But it just amazes me how many people watching it were more angry about the movie than they were about the fact that this actually used to occur. And the same is true at the age of consent. To pick out a few famous people that, for, like I said, I just listed the age of consent laws, but to pick a few famous people that had underage marriages, a lot of Henry VIII's wives were underage when he married them, just to pick one famous historical example. Another one, Grover Cleveland, his wife was not underage when he married her, but he adopted her when she was still a child. And then he married her around age 21 when he was like 49, 50. So again, there are a couple of famous examples from the past. But the thing is here's one, okay, we're going to compare this with a behavior that PaxTube said is immoral now that used to be illegal. Homosexuality. Some people obviously oppose homosexuality, both back then and now. I have no issues with it, but I used to back when I was a fundamentalist Christian because it is clearly written in the Bible, I will say that homosexuality is not permissible. The only way, if you read the Bible in a way that doesn't say that, you basically have to just assume that nothing in the Bible can be interpreted literally, which I would say that's a positive thing, except for the fact that many of the people who say that will still say, no, the Bible is holy and you can interpret this parts of it holy, and they cherry pick the parts they like. But then if they say, homosexuality is okay, then they'll just say, well, no. These verses are being taken hugely out of context. These verses that openly say that homosexuals are going to hell and should be stoned, no, that's irrelevant. Well, as an atheist, I believe the Bible is is no different than any other book. It was written back in the Bronze and Iron Age and should be taken with a grain of salt, and a lot of it is just stupid and evil and irrelevant. Some of it's good, most of it not. And of course, comparing it with some of the other behaviors I've listed that used to be tolerated and are not tolerated in the US, honestly, I don't see how you could put these two in the same camp, homosexuality or exploitation of underage people, For instance, and I guess this is just a value judgment on my part, because homosexuality, as long as it's between both people who are adults and consenting, and if you take religion out of the mix, I just don't see reason to take a big issue with it, And increasingly, that's the way a lot of people are. I mean, and really, back when I was in the fundamentalist world, a lot of people didn't have a big issue with it if it weren't for the religious texts that give them an issue with it, But PaxTube, obviously, he decries that as being a sin in his video. And then the last thing I'm going to focus on here, the PaxTube talks about as being an immoral practice that was not tolerated in the old days and tolerated nowadays, is pornography. Porn is a very, very interesting one to bring up when comparing old values with modern ones because, well, for one, the internet has vastly changed this. Obviously in the 1800s, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have Pornhub. They didn't have a lot of these other sites. And one note I will bring up on this, for one, not all forms of pornography are legal in the modern world. And FYI, this is something I completely agree with. Not all forms should be legal. Obviously, child porn, things where animals are involved, certain types of violent porn are restricted, and they should be for good reason. Okay, and this may be a little bit of a weird example, but I am going to inject a couple of personal examples in this because honestly, this is mostly a value judgment. There are people who will give you statistics and stuff on why pornography is bad for you. And there will be people who say why it's relatively harmless. Honestly, I've seen statistics that go both ways. And so I'll just have to inject my own personal experience onto this one and let you make of it what you will. But literally one time in my life when I was cruising around on the internet, I actually did run across something that was definitely illegal porn that had not yet been flagged as such. And it was actually on YouTube. And I'm not going to go into the nature of the video in too much of detail because I don't want to, and I don't think you want to hear it. And you don't want to hear it. But it was abundantly clear to me and I will just tell you this, it involved animal abuse in the video. And after seeing it, I, in addition to the many other people who are flagging it, immediately flagged it. And there was a number of people in the comments that were immediately also decrying, what the hell is this? How did I run across this? And again, I feel a little awkward telling you this, but like I said, this was an accident. The thumbnail was in Russian, and I couldn't tell what it was from the thumbnail when I clicked on it. And it wasn't until I got a few minutes into it that I realized what it was. But I can tell you, I've seen, and I'll just be honest with you, I watched other forms of porn and other types of media like that throughout my life, both as a Christian and an atheist, and none of it even begins to compare with what I saw in that one video. Okay, for those of you that think that, forms of illegal, that there's really no difference between these two mediums, the types that are made illegal and some of the other types that are considered generally acceptable, if you saw the difference between the two, you would quickly realize why. Okay. But again, I know you're going to have to somewhat just trust my judgment a little on this. I know I can't go into too much detail on it, but it's just because it's not something, I might be afraid my video would even be flagged if I went into too much detail going into it. So I'm just not going to describe, I'll just say this specific video that I ran across involved animal abuse, unfortunately, and it was pretty horrific. But the thing is also when you look at, how porn has changed, I can understand why there are some cases being made, why there has to be certain things regulated within the modern world, because the internet has completely changed how we deal with things like porn. Back in the 1800s, it would be like just a few magazines or whatever, or a few movies that a few people had to, creep into at night to see in some random district of where there was poorly regulated within a city. Nowadays, you could find literally a million videos at the click of your finger within a millisecond, And that kind of has changed the nature of how we regulate and how we look at it. And perhaps there does need to be a little bit of a way in which we, I don't know, limit exposure to these kind of things. But at the same time, the people who want you to believe that it is this horrible, terrible sin on par with rape, on par with the illegal forms of porn, on par with sexual assault, all of the horrible things like that. These people, I can just tell you, they disgust me to my core. And now I'm going to inject another personal example of what I mean by this. As many of you know, I'm an atheist, and I grew up in a religious background. And the last church service I went to voluntarily, in which someone wasn't strong-arming me into going, was my freshman year of college, and it was a men's Bible study in which they tried to get us to all confess our different internet viewing habits. And it was roughly like 25 to 30 guys, all of them, undergrad and college age guys. And to be honest, it was one of the worst experiences I've ever been to in a religious service. And I've been to some pretty bad ones growing up in the religious fundamentalist world. And what disgusted me about it, in addition to the fact that I heard way, way, way more than I wanted to about a bunch of random dudes' stuff that they've looked at on the internet. The thing that disgusted me is that even if you believe it to be wrong, even if you believe something like porn to be wrong, even if you believe it to be detrimental to one's health, it is ultimately between either you and yourself and your computer, or if you believe in a God, it's between you and your God. It is not between you and preachers or a room full of other people looking to peer into your internet viewing habits. And this really should not be an area of disagreement, even between religious people that are conservatives and more people like myself that are secular atheists that are more permissive overall towards it. Because ultimately, one way or the other, this is something that concerns your own life. And we're excluding things, of course, that do deal with, types of porn that, take advantage of the actresses and things like that. That's a whole nother issue, and that's involving more the people that run the porn industry, and that's, just viewing it on the internet, you're not patronizing them any more than you're patronizing that if you watched a movie that treated their actors and actresses badly, that you're responsible for that behavior. I just fuck that nonsense. But what I'm saying is ultimately, even if you believe it to be wrong, it is still not your business to get into other people's habits as long as they're not exploiting other people, okay? And that goes for atheists, Christians, and everybody. And that's what disgusted me so much when I was in that men's Bible study for the last session religious service I ever went to, is something that I had already at that age been very critical of myself and been trying to regulate on myself because I believed it to be an immoral thing, was now being peered into by a bunch of other gross, pervy men who really had no business peering into it and who were all confessing things that were far more disgusting and things that I really did not want to know about their internet viewing habits in that group. And it kind of dawned on me. I remember it made me feel so sick to my stomach after going to that, thinking, something about this is really messed up and wrong. Because even back then when I believed in a God, I knew, and I still to this day, it is between you, for those of you who are Christians and believe in a God, it is between you and your God, okay? Even if you believe it's bad for you, that is between you and a God. And it is totally different than something like sexual assault, rape, age, things that violate laws of age of consent, child marriage, divorce. All of these do greatly impact other people. But ultimately, what you do in your own time does not. And what you do with yourself in your own privacy does not. And as one of my icons, Christopher Hitchens, would say, shun the transcendent and all who invite you to annihilate or subordinate yourselves to them. Okay? People who are that invested in wanting to know what you are doing in your private life and condemn it are people that you should be wary of any type, be they religious, be they liberal, be they whatever. And there are a lot of liberals that can be that way. Kind of going back to, when I talked about with the fetishization of, the past and talking about how everything was perfect. I've met a lot of liberals who do this as well, like some extreme environmentalists who try to, fetishize nature and try to pretend that everything out in the wild is this wonderful, like live action version of the Lion King where all the animals live in this perfect, wonderful order of harmony, and they all sing Kumbaya together. Well, anyone who actually, if you watch a little bit of nature for too long, you begin to realize how horrendously cruel nature actually is. Oftentimes in the wild, baby animals are the first ones killed or eaten, sometimes by their own parents. There's no rules in nature other than survival of the fittest. Nature is incredibly cruel, and it may be pretty from the outside, but the deeper you get into it, the less pretty it is. And I also remember environmental liberals that would try to portray tribal, like ancient tribes or modern, or like Indian tribes or other things as being the height of civilization because I guess they were more in tune with nature, they were not industrialized, they weren't, I don't know, they didn't have all of the evils of modernism. And those people were almost as aggressive as to me as the religious conservatives that I grew up with, because they really were willing to discard many of the very, very hard fought and hard developed changes that have taken place in humanity over thousands of years in favor of some stupid fantasy about how perfect the world used to be and how if we just basically annihilate society, we can go back to that. And essentially, it's really just a liberal version of that same religion that I grew up with. I mean, society is not perfect now. The modern world isn't perfect, okay? But it had its problems in the past, as I've kind of described in a little bit of detail here, with things like polygamy, child marriage, no age of consent laws, and many, many other things. I mean, these are just relating to, as I said, this video is focused on things related to the sexual revolution and things that are permissible now and things that used to not be permissible. But obviously, there's a million other things that have changed too. Like in his video, just to cover a few final points on it, on things that I kind of went into and things that I looked at his video that I took issue with. PaxTube talks a lot in his video about how nihilism has taken over in the modern world. And to some extent, this is, as some of you who have watched my previous videos know, especially the ones where I dress as the Joker, that's a topic I talk about in this video because I'm a big fan of Friedrich Nietzsche. And Friedrich Nietzsche's main point about nihilism was that, yes, the world will have to deal with nihilism in the wake of the collapse of Christianity, because ultimately we are realizing that a lot of the values that we used to ascribe to for hundreds of years that have already been evolving, by the way. I mean, there's a lot of evolution between Christianity back in the year 124 AD and the year 2024 AD. But anyways, what I'm just saying is these have evolved, and of course he was predicting is that would lead to some nihilism. And nihilism actually, PaxTube defines it incorrectly in his video. He defines it as, the belief that nothing matters. Yeah, just the belief that nothing matters. Well, that's not true. Nihilism is the belief that, at least certain forms of nihilism, is the belief that all meaning and morals in life are, objectively speaking, they are baseless. And there essentially is no absolute meaning and morals in life in the religious context, that it's absolute and unchangeable. Excuse me. And there's an important distinction between what Friedrich Nietzsche talked about when he talked about nihilism, between active nihilism and passive nihilism. Active nihilism is the belief that despite that, which of course I ascribe to this belief, that there may not be absolute meaning and morals in life, at least possibly there may not be, but that doesn't mean you cannot still create meaning and morals. That does not mean society or individuals cannot find meaning and morals in this world. It just means that they are not, in the religious sense, objective and non-changing. Passive nihilism is essentially kind of the view of like the Joker, which is that there is no meaning and morals in life and there's no point in creating any, so you may as well just do whatever you want. And that's kind of why I do my Joker gig in the videos, for those of you who don't know why. Also, I like the Joker. And it's just kind of a way to make my boring videos a little more tolerable, But anyways, that was another point he brought up in this. There's a lot of things, he also talks about in this that just, historically speaking, are kind of nonsense. Like where he talks about how World War I was, it rocked Europe and it led to a lot of revolutions that were all non-European. I'm sorry. He described them as being anti-European, which I don't actually know what he means by that. Like Marxism, Karl Marx was a European. I'm not even a Marxist. I do not agree with most tenets of Marxism. But again, yeah, the communist revolution was probably a little bit caused by World War I and the Soviet Union and Russia. But it wasn't non-European. And World War I definitely had an impact on Europe, and it rocked Europe to its core. But I mean, a lot of those revolutions probably would have happened one way or the other. You know, I mean, Germany under the Kaiser, I don't know how much longer they would have endured under that monarchy. Granted, the fascism and Nazism that came place afterwards wasn't a lot better. But again, the czarist feudalist regime in Russia that was overtaken by the communist regime, I mean, who knows exactly what would have happened without World War I. But I mean, again, I don't understand, and for those of you that don't know why I'm relating this into the video, is because I don't know exactly what this has to do with the sexual revolution, but Pax2 brought it up in his video in relations to the sexual revolution about how European civilization started to change after that. And again, I think he's going way too far trying to bring it into things like that. But anyways, that's just another point that he brought up, was World War I being a factor in it. And lastly, one other thing he talked about in it was the American founding fathers, you know. And he talked about how a lot of them were primarily kind of in the middle on religion. I mean, they weren't all hardcore religious people, but they had a lot of non-traditional views on religion. And he is slightly misrepresented as they were, for the 1700s, a remarkably secular group of men. I mean, remember, this is the 1700s. Being a deist or agnostic, like Jefferson or Ben Franklin was back then, was essentially almost like being an atheist in the modern world. There were not very many atheists. There aren't very many atheists back now in the year 2024. I believe it's still only like, what, 3 to 5% of the population in the US. But back then it was even rarer. So, I mean, a lot of these men may have been closeted atheists, but the views that they were espousing were pretty secular at the time. Of course, not that that changes anything. That doesn't mean just because they were deists or agnostics back then that every Christian now has to convert back to being a deist or agnostic, or that atheists can't be. But this is often the example people try to use because they just want to, you know, condemn, say, well, they weren't, you know, they may have been secular thinkers like Ben Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, but they weren't full-on atheists like modern evil people. Well, yeah, that's because the world has changed a lot over the last 200 or 300 years. And needless to say, that's one thing that has changed, is that it's a lot easier to be a vocal atheist than it used to be. And obviously, being an atheist, I consider that to be a positive thing. But anyways, that was just one other point. And again, I don't know, maybe it doesn't relate to the sexual revolution directly, but he kind of tries to tie it into the sexual revolution in his video. So I made notes on different things here that I had, you know, taken issue with. And like I said, kind of going back to the original video, why I'm doing this follow-up, and my goodness, I can't believe this video has gone on for 37 minutes. Sorry for being so long-winded. Is my very first video I did on this. I didn't necessarily put a whole lot of time and energy into it, and then it ended up getting an enormous number of views and a lot of comments. So that's why I'm kind of trying to follow up on it just a little bit more. This is still just a random rant, and just like Pax2's video was basically a random rant as well. If you want a lot of information on a lot of these topics explored, I strongly recommend you go into, you know, different websites or books or documentaries to get the information. I'm going to post a few of the links here as well, just so some of you can understand where I got some of my information from. But hopefully this better clarified why I chose to do this video and why it kind of outraged me when I originally watched it. I hope you enjoyed this rather lengthy rant, and as usual, thanks for watching, and see you next time. Bye.